The winter air around Windsor Castle was heavy with the kind of stillness that makes you feel as if the world is holding its breath. The royal estate, usually a hive of quiet but purposeful activity, was cloaked in a chill that bit through the coats of staff rushing across the cobblestoned courtyards. Inside the palace walls, the corridors hummed with muffled footsteps and murmured conversations, the kind that meant something was happening, something no one wanted to talk about openly. For most of the staff, it was just another day of managing the intricate machinery of the monarchy. But for one small figure, alone in a shadowed corner of that grand estate, it would be a day she would never forget. Princess Charlotte had grown up under a microscope, her every public smile and wave dissected by newspapers and broadcast around the world. Yet behind the carefully curated public image was a child. Curious, spirited, and still learning the subtle rules of the royal world she had been born into. That day began like many others. Breakfast with her brothers, a visit to the schoolroom, and a quick dash to the palace gardens before lessons resumed. But something in the air was different, an undercurrent she couldn't quite name. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It wasn't unusual for Charlotte to cross paths with Queen Camilla in the palace. Their encounters were typically polite, distant affairs. Camilla was not the type to get down on the floor to play or join in children's chatter. Her role in the family had always been complicated, steeped in decades of history and public opinion. But there had been tension lately. Charlotte could feel it even if she didn't fully understand it. Camilla's glances seemed sharper, her tone clipped when she addressed the children, especially Charlotte. It was as if every small misstep the young princess made somehow grated against the queen consort's patience. The incident began quietly. A short exchange in one of the drawing rooms, a correction delivered by Camilla that Charlotte met with a flash of defiance, the kind of instinctive pushback only a child can give. No one else was in the room. No cameras, no aides, just the two of them and the unspoken weight of their positions. Charlotte, perhaps emboldened by her own stubborn streak, refused to comply with whatever small demand was made of her. Camilla's eyes hardened. The walk from that drawing room to the old servants' wing was only a matter of minutes. But to Charlotte, it felt like stepping deeper into a part of the palace she barely knew. The air was colder there, the light dimmer. The walls were lined with faded portraits and long-forgotten furniture covered in sheets. At the end of a narrow corridor, Camilla opened a heavy wooden door. Inside was a small stone-floored chamber, not much more than a storage space, really, but its thick walls and narrow window made it feel like something out of another century. Charlotte didn't understand what was happening until the door shut behind her. She reached for the handle, but the latch didn't turn. The sound of footsteps retreating was swallowed by the dense silence of the room. At first, she thought it was a joke, some strange royal game she didn't know yet. But as the minutes passed, the novelty curdled into unease. The cold in the cell seeped up from the stone floor into her shoes, and the air smelled faintly of damp wood. There was no chair, no blanket, and most importantly, no sound of anyone coming back for her. Charlotte called out at first, her small voice echoing in the enclosed space, but no one answered. Her calls turned to knocks, then to pounding. She was used to the palace feeling large, but this felt infinite in a way that was terrifying. Hunger was not immediate. It was the thirst that began to gnaw at her. The air was dry, and each breath seemed to scrape her throat. Her lips grew chapped, and the tiny window above her head let in nothing but a strip of gray sky that slowly darkened. She didn't know how long she'd been there. Children have a way of losing all sense of time when fear takes over. But she knew the light was fading, and with it, her hope. The first tears came quietly. She pressed the back of her hand to her face, willing herself not to cry like a baby. But then the fear came in waves. What if no one found her? What if the door never opened? She imagined the worst things her young mind could conjure. Being forgotten, being left there overnight, the cold growing sharper until it hurt. Elsewhere in the palace, the day went on. Staff moved between staterooms. Aides prepared briefings for upcoming events, and the queen consort's public schedule continued without interruption. Camilla was seen smiling at a luncheon, exchanging pleasantries with guests, her demeanor betraying nothing. It was as if the small girl locked away in that forgotten chamber didn't exist. It was only much later, when the corridors began to quiet and the staff numbers thinned, that a chance passerby heard a faint sound from behind the heavy wooden door. The lock clicked, and light spilled into the chamber, illuminating a small figure curled against the wall, cheeks streaked with tears, her hair slightly mussed from resting her head against the cold stone. Charlotte blinked in the light, confusion and relief warring in her expression. She stepped forward slowly, unsure whether she should run or simply stand there and breathe the fresh air. The person who found her asked no questions in that moment, perhaps out of shock, perhaps out of fear of what the answer might be. Instead, they led her away quietly, back through the narrow corridor to the warmth of the more familiar palace rooms. There, the sounds of the royal household carried on as if nothing had happened. Charlotte's return went unnoticed by most. She slipped into her private rooms, changed into warmer clothes, and sat in silence. She didn't yet have the words to describe what she felt, the mixture of fear, betrayal, and a kind of understanding far beyond her years. But she knew one thing. What had happened to her was not an accident. And when she later recounted it to someone she trusted, her voice trembled, but her words were clear. Camilla had left her there on purpose, without food or water, until she cried herself to sleep. From that moment, the relationship between them was no longer something that could be patched over with polite smiles for the cameras. This was deeper, sharper, and destined to leave a mark on the young princess for years to come. The question was, how much of the truth would ever be allowed to see the light? And if it did, what would it do to a monarchy already under strain? The cell was not marked on any official blueprint of Windsor Castle. In fact, it wasn't even called a cell by those who knew of its existence. Officially, it was an old storage room tucked away in the unused servant quarters from a bygone era. But anyone who stepped inside knew that its purpose once upon a time had been far more sinister. The walls were too thick, the air too still, the window too high to be anything other than a space meant to keep someone in rather than something out. It sat at the far end of a seldom-used corridor, the kind that even staff who had worked in the palace for years sometimes forgot existed. The corridor itself bore the marks of age, faded floral wallpaper peeling in patches, a faint smell of dust and polish that clung to the air, and floorboards that creaked loudly with each step, as if protesting against any intrusion. This part of the palace had not been modernized in decades. The lighting was dim, with wall sconces casting a weak amber glow. To a child, it was a place out of a fairy tale, but not the good kind. More the kind with locked towers and curses whispered in the dark. Charlotte had only been in that wing a handful of times in her life. Once during a hide-and-seek game with George, another time when she had accidentally wandered there chasing after one of the palace's many cats. But she had never been near the heavy oak door at the very end. The door itself was imposing, reinforced with thick metal bands and a lock mechanism that looked centuries old. It had no ornamentation, no sign, nothing to suggest what lay behind it. And perhaps that was the most unsettling thing. The mystery of the space was part of its power. On the day in question, Camilla had guided her down that hall without a word. Charlotte had followed at first out of confusion rather than fear. It wasn't unusual for senior royals to walk younger family members through parts of the palace, pointing out historical details or telling family stories. But there was no such commentary this time. Camilla's steps were brisk, her jaw set, her gaze fixed ahead. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the stillness, an eerie counterpoint to Charlotte's growing sense of unease. When they reached the door, Camilla produced a key from the pocket of her tailored jacket, a key Charlotte had never seen before. It was long, made of blackened iron, and when she inserted it into the lock, it turned with a low, grinding sound. The door creaked open to reveal a small, windowed chamber. The light from the hallway barely reached the corners of the room. The walls were bare stone, and the floor was cold underfoot. There was no furniture save for an old wooden bench pushed against one wall, and even that was covered in dust. The only source of natural light was a narrow slit of a window set high in the wall, far out of reach for a child, or even an adult, for that matter. Camilla stepped aside and gestured for Charlotte to go inside. The girl hesitated. Something about the way Camilla's expression didn't soften made her stomach tighten. But she stepped forward anyway, thinking perhaps there was something inside she was meant to fetch or look at. The moment she crossed the threshold, the door swung shut behind her, and the sound of the lock clicking into place rang loud in the tiny space. She turned instantly, hands gripping the handle, but it wouldn't budge. On the other side of the door, there was no sound, no explanation, no footsteps retreating, nothing. Just silence. Charlotte called out at first, her voice bouncing back to her in an echo that made her feel even smaller. When no answer came, she tried the handle again, her small fingers straining against the metal. Still nothing. The panic rose slowly at first, like water seeping under a door, but then it surged. She pounded on the wood, the sharp sound hurting her hands. "Please," she called again, but the only response was the muted hum of the wind through the tiny window slit. The minutes passed in a strange, dreamlike way. At first, she paced the small space, tracing the uneven lines of mortar between the stones. She sat on the bench, then stood again, then crouched on the floor, staring at the door as if sheer willpower could make it open. The light from the narrow window began to shift, marking the passage of time in cruel increments. It was then that she noticed the temperature dropping. The stone floor seemed to radiate cold, and soon her small hands felt numb. She tucked them under her arms, trying to keep warm, but the chill crept in regardless. The hunger began as a faint pang in her stomach, but it was the thirst that became unbearable. She had been outside in the gardens earlier that morning, and the winter air had already left her lips dry. Now, sealed in the room with no water, every swallow felt scratchy, each breath a reminder of how dry her mouth was. She thought of the kitchens, with their smells of baking bread and simmering soups, and for a moment, she almost convinced herself that someone would soon appear with a tray. But no one came. Charlotte had never thought much about the idea of being forgotten before. As a royal, she was rarely left alone for long. But now, with the light fading and the air growing colder, the thought began to claw at her. What if no one even knew she was here? What if everyone assumed she was somewhere else? In lessons, with a nanny, with her brothers. The palace was enormous. People could go hours without crossing paths. The more she thought about it, the more her fears solidified into something heavy and immovable in her chest. From outside, no one passing by would have guessed that the thick walls hid a frightened child. The cell gave nothing away. It was soundproof enough to muffle cries, secluded enough that footsteps were rare in the corridor. Its very existence was a kind of secret, known to only a few, and those who knew would never speak of it to the press or the public. It was one of many hidden corners in the palace, remnants of a history that was never meant to be fully told. But to Charlotte, it was now more than a room. It was a place that marked a shift, a before and after. Before, she had thought of the palace as vast but safe. After, she would see its corridors differently, wondering what other locked doors hid and who held the keys. By the time she was found, the cell had become etched into her memory, not just for the physical discomfort, but for the feeling that someone had deliberately placed her there and walked away. That knowledge sat heavier than the cold stone walls, and it would be the seed of the story that would one day reach far beyond the palace gates. It began as an ordinary morning, the kind that gives no hint of the storm that will follow. Windsor Castle woke to the soft clatter of breakfast service, the low murmur of aides discussing schedules, and the occasional burst of laughter from George and Louis as they chased each other down the long corridor outside the family's private rooms. Princess Charlotte had joined them briefly, dressed in a neatly pressed winter dress of deep green wool, her hair tied back with a ribbon that matched. The sky beyond the tall windows was a pale blue, the kind that suggested the day would be cold but bright. Breakfast had been a family affair, though slightly more formal than usual. Charles had been absent, occupied with a morning meeting, but Camilla had been present, her manner brisk and watchful. Charlotte had noticed the way the queen consort's eyes followed her, not warmly, but with an expression she couldn't quite place. There had been a moment, small but sharp, when Charlotte reached for an extra slice of toast, and Camilla's voice cut across the table, telling her to wait. It was said with the thin smile of someone who expected instant obedience. Charlotte, stubborn by nature, hesitated just long enough for the silence to feel noticeable. It was the kind of exchange most adults might have brushed aside within minutes, but the air between them stayed taut. After breakfast, William left for a scheduled charity engagement. Catherine remained upstairs with Louis, and George was taken to a study session with his tutor. That left Charlotte in the care of palace staff, and within Camilla's orbit. The queen consort had a habit of appearing in unexpected places, and that morning she caught Charlotte alone near the music room. The interaction began politely enough, Camilla asking where she was headed, but there was an edge beneath the words. Charlotte, sensing it, answered quickly that she was looking for her sketchbook. Camilla's eyes lingered on her, as though weighing a decision. Then, without warning, she told Charlotte to follow her. It was not unusual for senior royals to give such directions. Children in the palace learned early on that adults of rank were to be obeyed without question. So Charlotte followed. She trailed a few paces behind as Camilla moved with quiet purpose through the halls, past rooms she knew well, and into quieter wings she rarely visited. The warmth of the main corridors gave way to cooler, older sections of the castle, where the ceilings lowered and the lighting dimmed. Charlotte's steps slowed when she realized where they were headed. She had been down this hall before only in passing, the one that ended in a heavy, locked door. She remembered the musty smell here, the way sound seemed to fade into the thick stone walls. She glanced at Camilla, hoping for some explanation, but the older woman's expression revealed nothing. At the end of the corridor, Camilla produced the key. It was the same dark, heavy piece of iron Charlotte would later recall in detail. She turned it in the lock with a slow, deliberate twist, and the door opened on its complaining hinges. Without a word, Camilla gestured for Charlotte to step inside. The young princess hesitated, her eyes flicking from the cold stone room to the queen consort's unblinking gaze. Something in her chest tightened, but she moved forward. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a final note in a song she didn't want to hear. It clicked shut with a weight that made the air in the room feel thinner. She spun around just in time to see Camilla's face through the narrowing gap before the latch caught. The queen consort's expression was not one of playfulness or even anger. It was something more distant, as though Charlotte were a problem being set aside rather than a child being disciplined. At first, Charlotte tried to call out, her voice rising in pitch. She thought perhaps this was some kind of lesson, a brief timeout meant to make her reflect. But when her calls met only silence, the unease began to settle deeper. The walls seemed to draw closer, the air colder. She pressed her ear to the door, straining for any sound, footsteps, voices, anything, but heard nothing. Time inside the cell felt different. 10 minutes could have been 30, or it could have been 5. Without light or sound, the minutes bled into one another. Charlotte shifted from standing to sitting on the cold floor, then back to pacing. She thought of her mother upstairs, of George and his lesson, of Louis probably laughing at something silly. She thought of the kitchens and the smell of baking bread that usually floated through the palace. Her mouth was dry already, and she began to notice the ache in her stomach. She didn't cry at first. Crying, she told herself, was for when there was no other choice. But as the light from the narrow window shifted, the reality set in. She didn't know how long she would be here. She thought about trying to climb the bench to reach the window, but it was too high and the bench too rickety. She sat back down, hugging her knees to her chest. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the castle, life carried on. A luncheon was being prepared for later that day. Couriers came and went with documents for Charles to sign. Guests arrived for a private tour, greeted by Camilla herself, smiling and speaking with the polished charm of a practiced royal hostess. No one could have guessed that in a locked room deep within the castle, a young princess sat in the cold, her lips pressed tightly together to keep from calling out again. It wasn't until much later, Charlotte would never know exactly how much later, that a faint noise outside the door broke the monotony. She jumped to her feet, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder. The measured pace of footsteps in the corridor, then the metallic scrape of a key in the lock. The door opened just wide enough for a figure to peer in. A staff member, their eyes widening at the sight of her. No questions, no immediate explanations, just a hand extended to lead her out. Charlotte stepped into the corridor, the light feeling strange after the dimness. She said nothing, and neither did the staffer. The walk back to her own rooms was silent, but her mind was loud with questions. Why had she been brought there? Why had the door been locked? And perhaps the most troubling of all, why did it feel like no one would believe her if she told them the truth? That was the day it happened, the day a bond, already fragile, between the young princess and the queen consort was irrevocably altered. It was a day that would live in Charlotte's memory as both a moment of fear and a lesson in the unspoken rules of her family's world. Not everything that happens behind palace walls will ever see the light, and sometimes the coldest rooms aren't just made of stone. The sound of the lock turning was unlike anything Charlotte had heard before. Not the light click of an interior latch, but the deep, mechanical grind of metal against metal. It resonated in the small space, as though the stone walls themselves absorbed the sound and held it. That noise, sharp and final, seemed to echo inside her chest. She would later remember it in detail, as vividly as the expression on Camilla's face in the seconds before the door closed. Charlotte's eyes darted toward the door even as her instincts told her it was already too late. She rushed forward, her small hands gripping the heavy iron handle, twisting it with all her might. The handle didn't budge. She twisted again, harder this time, her fingers beginning to ache from the cold of the metal. She could hear footsteps, measured, unhurried, retreating along the corridor outside. She pressed her ear against the wood, hoping to catch a word, a clue, something that would tell her why she had been left here. But all she could hear was the fading echo of those steps, and, beyond that, nothing at all. For a moment, Charlotte simply stood there, staring at the door as if expecting it to open again. But as the silence thickened, she began to feel the weight of the space pressing in around her. The narrow window high above her head offered no view except a strip of gray sky. The light was weak, and it did little to warm the air. The room had no furniture beyond the old bench, and the floor was so cold it seemed to seep into her shoes, crawling up her legs until she shivered involuntarily. She tried knocking at first, firmly but not desperately. The sound was hollow, muffled by the thick wood. She waited. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, her small fist hitting the door in quick, sharp bursts. Still nothing. Her throat tightened, and she found herself calling out, her voice wavering slightly. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The only reply was the faint hiss of wine through the slit of a window. She tried again, louder now, but the stone walls swallowed her words. Her breathing grew faster as she stepped back from the door. The space suddenly felt smaller, the air thinner. She walked the perimeter of the room, running her fingers along the rough stone, as if searching for a hidden latch or a panel that might lead to an escape. There was nothing. The stones were cold and unyielding, their surfaces worn smooth in places by years of damp air. She reached the corner and crouched down, her arms wrapped around her knees. She told herself she wasn't afraid, that this was just some sort of misunderstanding, that someone would come soon. But in her heart, a knot of fear began to form. Time stretched strangely in that room. Without a clock, she had no way of knowing how long she had been there. The light through the window shifted imperceptibly, but that was the only sign that the world outside was moving at all. Her stomach gave a small, involuntary growl, reminding her that breakfast had been hours ago. But it was the dryness in her mouth that bothered her most. Each swallow scraped her throat, and the more she thought about it, the more she longed for a sip of water. She imagined the cool glasses served in the dining room, beads of condensation on the outside, and the thought made her throat ache. She stood again and tried the door one more time. The handle remained immovable, its refusal somehow more frustrating now. She pounded on it with both fists, the sound reverberating through her arms. Her voice cracked as she called out, the desperation now audible. "Please, let me out." Still no reply. The walls, the floor, the air, they all seemed indifferent to her pleas. At some point, the cold began to seep deeper into her, making her fingers stiff and her shoulders hunch involuntarily. She climbed onto the bench in an attempt to reach the window, but it was too high. Standing on tiptoe, she could just see the thin slice of sky, now darkening as clouds moved across it. The bench wobbled slightly beneath her, and she quickly stepped down, unwilling to risk a fall. Her thoughts began to turn inward. She wondered if her mother knew where she was, if George had noticed she was missing from their usual playtime. She thought about Louis, who would probably ask for her if she wasn't there for dinner. Would anyone tell them? Would they even know she was here? The idea that no one knew chilled her in a way the cold air never could. The sound of the lock had been the start, but it was the silence afterward that truly unsettled her. It was an intentional silence, one that told her this wasn't an accident. She was here because someone had put her here and decided she would stay. That thought brought a heaviness to her chest, a weight she wasn't used to carrying. For a child who had always been surrounded by people, by protection, by constant supervision, the sudden absence of all of it felt like being set adrift in an ocean with no sight of land. She sat back down on the bench, her legs dangling above the floor. She stared at the door, willing it to open, telling herself she just had to be patient. But somewhere deep inside, she knew patience had nothing to do with it. This was not about waiting politely for the right moment. This was about being kept in, deliberately, until someone else decided otherwise. The minutes ticked on, though she could no longer measure them. Her eyes grew heavy, her body curling inward as the cold and the exhaustion took over. When she finally heard the sound of footsteps again, hours later, though she didn't know it, her body jolted upright, her heart racing. The sound of a key in the lock was sharper now, and the creak of the door was like a breath of air after being underwater too long. Light from the corridor spilled in, making her squint. She saw the outline of a figure, not Camilla this time, and a hand reached out to her. She stepped forward slowly, unsure if she was meant to be grateful or afraid. In that moment, she realized she would never forget the sound of that door locking, nor the cold finality of knowing that someone had chosen to close it on her. That single action, so simple in its mechanics, had changed the way she would see the people and the palace around her forever. The darkness inside the room was not absolute. The narrow window high in the wall allowed a thin, pale ribbon of daylight to stretch across the floor, but it was enough to make the space feel closed in, foreign, and unwelcoming. For Charlotte, it was the kind of darkness that crept into her thoughts, making the edges of her imagination sharper and more dangerous. Every sound was magnified. The faint hum of the wind outside, the shifting creak of the old wooden bench, even the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. At first, she tried to keep her mind busy, telling herself little stories, humming songs under her breath, counting the stones along the wall. Anything to keep her thoughts from circling back to the fact that she was here alone, with no food, no water, and no idea when she would be let out. But time in the cell had a way of eroding those distractions. Minutes felt like hours, and with each passing stretch of silence, her small acts of defiance, the knocking, the calling out, began to fade. The cold was the first thing that really got to her. It seemed to seep up from the floor, through her shoes, into her legs. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, trying to make herself smaller to conserve heat. Her breath came out in faint clouds that hovered for a moment before disappearing. She could feel the stiffness settling into her fingers, making it harder to move them. The hunger came next, a slow, hollow ache in her stomach. But thirst was worse. Her lips felt dry and tight, and each time she swallowed, it felt like sandpaper scratching at her throat. She thought of the tall crystal glasses of water at the palace dining table, the way droplets formed on the outside when they were filled with cold water, and the memory made her mouth ache even more. She licked her lips, but it did nothing. The longer she sat there, the more her thoughts turned toward fear. What if no one came? What if the people who usually looked out for her didn't even know she was missing? The palace was huge. People could go hours without crossing paths. If her brothers asked where she was, would someone tell them she was fine, that she was just busy? Would her mother be told she had gone to her lessons? Her mind began to wander into dangerous territory, imagining herself still sitting there as night fell, the light from the window fading completely, the room going black. She pictured shadows moving in the corners, the sounds of old stones settling, making her jump. She knew it was just her imagination, but fear doesn't care about logic. The first tears came slowly. She blinked hard to stop them, swiping at her face with the back of her hand. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to give whoever had locked her in the satisfaction of knowing she was afraid. But eventually, the tears came faster, her breath hitching in small, uneven bursts. She buried her face in her knees, letting the sobs shake her small frame. She thought of her mother's voice, the way Catherine's tone softened when she comforted her after a bad dream. She thought of her father, always calm, always ready with a gentle hand on her shoulder. She wished, more than anything, that one of them would walk through the door at that moment and take her away from the cold and the dark. Her tears left her feeling drained, and eventually she shifted to lying on the bench, curling onto her side. The bench was narrow, and the wood was hard against her hip, but it was better than sitting on the freezing floor. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to block out the view of the walls pressing in around her. Her thoughts drifted to the gardens, to sunny afternoons chasing butterflies with George and Louis, to the smell of flowers and fresh grass. For a few moments, she could almost forget where she was. But then a shiver ran through her, and the illusion broke. She sat up, glancing again at the door, willing it to open. She thought she heard footsteps once, and her heart leapt, but they faded quickly, leaving her in silence again. The light in the window began to change, taking on the muted gray of late afternoon. The strip of brightness on the floor grew shorter, the corners of the room deepening into shadow. Charlotte knew, in a way that only children do, that when the light was gone, everything would feel worse. Her mind would invent shapes in the dark. Every sound would seem louder. Every second would feel longer. She curled up again, resting her head on her arms. Her eyes burned from crying, and her cheeks felt tight from dried tears. The hunger and thirst were constant now, dull and insistent, but it was the cold that was hardest to ignore. She thought again about her warm bed upstairs, the soft blankets, the familiar smell of her pillow. It felt like another world. It was in that cold, dim room that a new thought settled into her mind, one she didn't want to believe. Someone had done this to her on purpose. Not by mistake, not as part of a game, but deliberately. And that someone was a person who smiled for cameras, who the world thought of as a grandmother figure to her. That realization made her chest feel heavier than any stone wall. The tears came again, quietly this time, slipping down her cheeks as she tried to keep herself from making a sound. She didn't want anyone to hear her cry, not even the empty room. When she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, it wasn't out of comfort, but out of exhaustion, her body giving in to the weight of fear, cold, and loneliness. When the door eventually opened, she would wake in a haze, her head pounding, her throat parched, the world outside the cell feeling too bright. But in this moment, in the heart of the dark, all she had was the sound of her own breathing and the heavy knowledge that she was utterly alone. The discovery happened almost by accident. The palace, despite its grandeur and meticulous routines, had its moments of unpredictability. Staff moved in and out of its endless rooms according to schedules, but sometimes those schedules overlapped, and sometimes someone wandered down a hallway they didn't usually use. That was what led to the unlocking of the door that day. Not a coordinated search, not a frantic rescue, but a chance moment born out of someone taking an unexpected route. It was late afternoon by then, though Charlotte had lost any real sense of time. The pale light from the high window had grown weaker, the strip across the floor shrinking until it was nothing more than a faint smudge on the wall. The shadows had stretched long and heavy, pressing into the corners like dark pools. She was lying curled on her side on the bench, her body stiff from the cold, her lips dry and cracked. Her eyelids were heavy, not from rest, but from the exhausting cycle of crying, waiting, and fighting the urge to cry again. In the corridor outside, a low murmur of voices was the first sign that someone was near. Charlotte stirred slightly, her ears straining. The voices were muffled, distant at first, but growing closer. The sound of footsteps followed, deliberate but unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone moving through an area they didn't expect to find anything unusual in. The first voice belonged to one of the senior household staff, a man known for his efficiency and quiet demeanor. He was walking alongside a younger maid who carried a basket of linens. They were headed toward the old storage rooms at the end of the corridor, intending to fetch an antique piece that had been requested for display in one of the guest suites. They had no idea that behind one of those doors, a princess sat in silence. As they approached the heavy oak door, the maid paused, frowning. She thought she heard something, faint, almost imperceptible, from inside. At first, she dismissed it as the creak of old wood in the draft, but then it came again, a small, dry cough. She stopped, shifting the basket to one arm, and tilted her head toward the door. "Did you hear that?" she asked quietly. The man glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Hear what?" She gestured toward the door. "Something. Like a voice, maybe." He stepped closer, pressing his ear to the cold wood. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the sound of movement, the scrape of fabric against stone. He straightened, the crease between his eyebrows deepening. "This room shouldn't be in use," he murmured, more to himself than to her. The maid hesitated. "Do we?" He nodded, already fishing a ring of keys from his jacket pocket. The keys jingled softly, their metallic chime loud in the quiet corridor. He sorted through them until he found one long and blackened with age. It fit the lock perfectly, turning with a slow, heavy twist that released the mechanism with a deep click. When the door swung open, the dim light from the corridor spilled into the small chamber, cutting across the floor and up the wall. Charlotte flinched at the brightness, her eyes narrowing against it. She sat up slowly, blinking, her face pale and streaked with the remnants of dried tears. Her hair, usually so neatly brushed, had loosened from its ribbon, a few strands sticking to her damp cheeks. The man froze in the doorway, the sight of her clearly unexpected. For a second, neither of them spoke. Charlotte's lips parted, as if she meant to say something, but no sound came out. Her throat was too dry, her voice caught somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief that someone was finally there. "Your Highness," the man said softly, his tone a mixture of surprise and concern. "What on earth?" He didn't finish the sentence. The question hung there, unasked but heavy. The maid stepped forward, setting her basket down and crouching slightly to be closer to Charlotte's level. "Come on, let's get you out of here," she said gently. She held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Charlotte took it. Her fingers were cold, small, and limp in the maid's grasp. As they guided her into the corridor, the man glanced back into the cell. It was empty, save for the old bench and the small window. But something about the sight of it unsettled him, not because it was unusual for the palace to have such rooms, but because of the knowledge that someone had intentionally placed her inside and locked the door. He didn't ask her who had done it. Not then. Maybe he didn't want to hear the answer. Charlotte's steps were slow and uneven as they made their way back toward the warmer, livelier parts of the palace. Her eyes stayed downcast, her free hand clutching the edge of her dress as though it might anchor her. She didn't speak, and neither did the staff. There was an unspoken understanding that whatever had happened here wasn't something to discuss openly in the middle of a hallway. When they reached the main wing, the sound of the household returning to its usual rhythm washed over them. The clink of dishes from the kitchens, the muffled laughter of another staff member greeting a colleague, the faint strains of music from a distant room. It all felt surreal to Charlotte, as if the cold, silent hours in the cell had existed in an entirely different world. She was taken to her private quarters, where a lady-in-waiting was waiting with a warm blanket and a cup of water. The first sip was painful, the cool liquid making her throat ache before it soothed. She wrapped the blanket tightly around herself, sinking into the chair by the fire without a word. In that moment, she felt two things at once: relief that she was out, and the sinking knowledge that what had happened was deliberate. Whoever had locked that door had meant for her to stay inside, and that realization would sit heavy in her mind long after the fire's warmth replaced the chill in her bones. The confrontation did not happen immediately. In the royal family, timing is everything. Even when the subject is something as raw and urgent as a child being locked away without food or water, the household has its own rhythm, and William's return to Windsor that evening marked the moment when the stillness surrounding the event began to fracture. When he stepped into the private quarters he shared with Catherine, he was met by an uneasy hush. Usually, Charlotte would come running to greet him or at least peek around the corner with her characteristic mix of curiosity and pride. This time, she was nowhere in sight. Catherine sat in a high-backed chair near the fire, her face pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. William's eyes immediately scanned the room for their daughter, and when he didn't see her, the question came in a low, tense voice. "Where is Charlotte?" Catherine hesitated, glancing toward the inner doorway that led to Charlotte's sitting room. "She's resting," she said quietly. "Something happened today." It took only a few words for William to piece together enough of the truth to feel the surge of heat rise in his chest. Catherine's voice was measured as she explained how Charlotte had been found, pale, shivering, dehydrated, in an unused chamber in the old servants' wing. She avoided naming names at first, but William's eyes narrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening as the possibilities narrowed in his mind. "Who put her there?" he asked, each word clipped. Catherine met his gaze, her silence answer enough. The unspoken name hung in the air like smoke. William left without another word. His strides were long and purposeful as he made his way through the corridors toward the private apartments of the king and queen consort. Along the way, he passed staff members who quickly stepped aside, sensing the controlled storm in his demeanor. His entire life had been shaped by the unspoken rule of maintaining composure in public, but in private, especially when it came to his children, that composure had limits. Camilla was in her sitting room when he arrived, seated on a small sofa with a tea service on the table beside her. She looked up as he entered, her expression betraying mild surprise, but no apparent guilt. "William," she said, her tone polite but cool. "Is something wrong?" He closed the door behind him, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You know why I'm here." Her gaze held his steadily, her hands resting on the arm of the sofa. "I'm afraid I don't." "Don't," he said, his voice low but steady, the word carrying more weight than volume. "Don't pretend you don't know. Charlotte was found locked in one of the old servants' rooms. Hours without food, without water. Do you deny you put her there?" Camilla's expression barely shifted, but there was a tightening around her eyes. "William, you're overreacting." She was being difficult. I thought a little time to herself might encourage reflection. "In a freezing cell?" His voice sharpened, the restraint thinning. "She's 7 years old." She was terrified. "She'll survive," Camilla replied, her tone dismissive. "Children these days are coddled far too much. A bit of discomfort never hurt anyone." William took a step closer, his hands clenched at his sides. "This isn't about discomfort. This is about cruelty. You left her there deliberately. You heard her cries, and you walked away. That's not discipline. That's abuse." Camilla's eyes flicked away for a moment, a flash of something. Irritation, perhaps, passing over her features. "Mind your words, William. You're speaking to the queen consort." "I'm speaking as a father," he shot back. "And as a father, I'm telling you this will never happen again. If you so much as look at my children in that way again, I will not stay silent." The tension between them was thick, the kind of standoff that could not be softened by pleasantries or deflected by protocol. Camilla's lips pressed into a thin line, but she did not apologize. Instead, she reached for her teacup, lifting it with steady hands as if the conversation had been nothing more than an unpleasant formality. William stood for a moment longer, his breath slow but heavy. Then he turned and left, his steps echoing sharply against the marble floors. The confrontation had not resolved anything. If anything, it had drawn the lines deeper. Back in his own quarters, he found Charlotte asleep under a blanket, her breathing steady but her small hands curled tightly, as if still bracing against the cold. Catherine looked up at him, searching his face for signs of what had been said. William only shook his head, his jaw still set. In the palace, arguments can be hidden, stories reshaped, and events erased from official memory. But what had happened that day, and what had been said in that sitting room, would not be so easily forgotten by those who lived it. The confrontation had made one thing clear. The rift between William and Camilla was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It was out in the open now, raw and irreparable. The palace machinery is never more efficient than when it's working to hide something. Within hours of William's confrontation with Camilla, the quiet but deliberate gears of the royal public relations network began to turn. It wasn't announced, discussed, or debated. It simply happened, as though an invisible hand had flicked a switch and set everything into motion. The first step was information control. Palace aides were quietly instructed to monitor conversation among the household staff. This meant no casual gossip in corridors, no whispers exchanged in the servants' hall, and certainly no hints to outsiders. The 2 staff members who had discovered Charlotte were called into a private meeting with a senior aide, who thanked them for their discretion and reminded them, in a tone that left no room for misunderstanding, that any discussion of the matter would be a breach of confidentiality. One of them reportedly asked if the king knew. The aide's answer was measured but evasive. His Majesty is aware of all that he needs to be aware of. Then came the narrative crafting. The communications team gathered in a discreet side office, their phones on silent, laptops open to media monitoring dashboards. The objective was clear. If any trace of the incident reached the outside world, it needed to be neutralized before it took shape as a damaging story. They began drafting a set of preemptive talking points, a subtle, false trail of information that could be fed to trusted reporters if questions were asked. The official version, should it be needed, would be that Charlotte had been resting in a private room after feeling unwell during lessons and was attended to by staff. Meanwhile, in the palace corridors, the version told to certain senior figures was even more condensed, a minor misunderstanding, swiftly resolved. It was the kind of phrase that shut down curiosity without inviting challenge. And because so many people inside the monarchy's orbit have learned that the less they know, the safer they are, few asked for details. William and Catherine, however, were not part of this smoothing over operation. William's fury at the idea of his daughter's ordeal being repackaged into something harmless was immediate, but Catherine's counsel was measured. She reminded him that pushing too hard against the internal machine could make matters worse for Charlotte in the long run. "We have to be strategic," she said quietly, her eyes on the fire rather than his. "They will protect the institution before they protect us. We have to protect her ourselves." Camilla, for her part, carried on with her public schedule as though nothing had happened. The very next morning, she was photographed leaving a charity event, smiling for the cameras, wearing a soft pastel coat and pearl earrings. Her body language was relaxed, her wave to the crowd warm enough to be published in newspapers without suspicion. For the press photographers, it was just another day, and that was precisely the point. Behind the scenes, loyalists close to Camilla worked to subtly reinforce her image. A brief mention of her warm interactions with royal children was slipped into a press release about a recent engagement. An aide leaked to a friendly columnist that she had been keeping an eye on the younger royals, while their parents were busy with official duties. It was an old strategy: flood the public space with positive imagery so that, if a darker story surfaced, it would be drowned out before it could gain traction. But the most insidious part of the cover-up was the silence enforced within the walls of Windsor. Charlotte herself was spoken to by a senior figure, under the guise of concern. The conversation was gentle on the surface, lots of assurances that she was safe now, but threaded with careful messaging. She was told that sometimes things happen that we don't talk about outside the family, and that it's best not to confuse people with upsetting stories. To a child, these words could sound like comfort. To an adult, they were a directive. For days, the story remained contained. The palace moved forward as though the cell incident had never occurred. The staff who had seen her that day carried the memory silently, burying it beneath the weight of their own job security. In the world of royal service, truth is often the first casualty. Still, there were cracks. A brief overheard exchange between two aides in a corridor, a staff member's uneasy expression when asked about Charlotte's well-being, a faint but noticeable change in William's demeanor during public appearances. These small signals were enough to catch the attention of those who knew how to read them. The press hadn't caught on yet, but inside the palace, the memory of what had happened to Charlotte simmered quietly, a dangerous ember waiting for the wrong gust of wind. The cover-up had bought time, but it had not erased the truth. The royal family thrives on controlling narratives, yet no matter how carefully they are crafted, some stories refuse to stay buried. This one was too personal, too raw, and involved too many people who had seen more than they were supposed to. It was only a matter of time before the silence cracked wide open, and when it did, the palace machine would have to work far harder than it had in those first quiet hours. It happened quietly, without cameras or ceremony, in a part of the palace far from the corridors where staff and senior royals moved. Charlotte had been unusually silent in the days following the incident. She did not complain, nor did she openly speak of what had happened to her. But her silences were not the comfortable kind. They were weighted, watchful, as if she were measuring every word before it left her lips. She was in her sitting room one late afternoon when Catherine entered, carrying a small tray with tea and a plate of her favorite biscuits. The princess was curled in an armchair by the window, her knees drawn up under her chin, staring out at the cloudy sky. She looked up when her mother came in, her expression neutral, but her eyes tired in a way that unsettled Catherine. "I thought you might like some tea," Catherine said gently, setting the tray down on the low table. Charlotte didn't move toward it, just nodded faintly. For a while, Catherine didn't ask any questions. She sat beside her daughter and poured the tea, letting the quiet settle between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. I know something happened the other day, she said. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. But I want you to know that you can. Charlotte didn't answer immediately. She kept her gaze on the window, tracing the raindrops as they began to streak down the glass. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, twisting the fabric. Then, without looking at her mother, she said, "She locked me in there." The words were small, but they carried the kind of clarity that only comes from having repeated them silently in your head many times. Catherine's chest tightened. "Who, darling?" she asked, though she already knew. Charlotte hesitated, as if saying the name would make it more real. "Camilla," she whispered. She shut the door and didn't come back. Her voice trembled on the last word, and Catherine reached for her hand. "Tell me what happened," she urged softly. And then it came out, halting at first, but building as Charlotte found the rhythm of the memory. She spoke of the long walk down the cold corridor, of the heavy door and the way the lock sounded when it turned. She described the room, the high window, the old bench, the cold floor, and how she had tried to reach the window but couldn't. She spoke of calling out, of pounding on the door, of the silence that followed. "She didn't bring me any water," Charlotte said, her small brow furrowing. "Not even when I asked. I was so thirsty I thought my throat would close up. And I got cold, really cold. I kept thinking someone would come, but no one did. I thought maybe everyone forgot about me." Her voice cracked then, and she swallowed hard. "I cried, but I didn't want to. I didn't want her to know she'd made me cry." Catherine listened without interrupting, her own anger kept behind a careful, calm expression. When Charlotte had finished, she leaned forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly. "No one will ever forget about you," she murmured. "You're my daughter. You're your father's daughter. You are loved and protected. What happened was wrong, and it should never have happened." Charlotte nodded against her shoulder, but she didn't speak again. The conversation lingered in the air long after they sat back, the weight of it too heavy for the room to contain. That night, Catherine shared the account with William, repeating Charlotte's words as closely as she could remember them. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each detail. When she finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "We keep this between us for now," he said finally. "But I'm not letting this go." The next morning, a subtle shift occurred. William and Catherine kept Charlotte closer, her schedule trimmed so she was rarely out of their sight. She noticed it, of course, but she didn't protest. In her young mind, being near her parents meant safety, and for the time being, that was enough. Still, her telling of the story, quiet though it was, marked the first breach in the wall the palace had built around the truth. Once spoken, the words could not be unsaid. And while they remained confined within the family's private rooms, their very existence meant that the truth was alive, waiting, patient, for the moment it would be heard beyond those walls. The moment the story began to leak beyond the palace walls, the world reacted with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and outrage. Royal watchers, journalists, and everyday citizens alike were stunned by the revelation that a young princess had been locked away in a cold, dark cell, left without food or water for hours. The image of Charlotte crying herself to sleep, vulnerable and alone, was difficult for many to reconcile with the polished public image carefully maintained by the royal family. Social media ignited almost immediately. Hashtags demanding justice for Charlotte trended worldwide, accompanied by heartfelt messages from fans and critics alike. Twitter feeds filled with comments expressing disbelief that such an incident could have taken place within one of the most famous households in the world. "How could they treat a child like this?" read one viral post. Another asked, "Where is the protection for our future queen?" The outpouring of emotion was swift and intense, showing just how deeply the story had struck a nerve. Traditional media outlets scrambled to report on the incident, balancing the delicate line between respect for privacy and public interest. Headlines were bold and unambiguous. Princess Charlotte's ordeal behind palace doors, the secret cell scandal shaking the monarchy, royal family under fire for child confinement. Some papers took a more investigative approach, digging into palace protocols, historical precedents, and the complex dynamics of royal discipline. Others focused on the human story, painting Charlotte as a symbol of innocence caught in the crossfire of palace politics. At the same time, there was a noticeable split in public opinion. Royal supporters and some commentators urged caution, emphasizing the need for facts before rushing to judgment. They pointed out the pressures and expectations placed on all members of the royal family, including the queen consort, and cautioned against painting Camilla as a villain without full evidence. "Let's remember this is a family dealing with complex situations," one columnist wrote. "Discipline and care can sometimes be difficult to balance." Yet for many, the incident was emblematic of larger issues within the monarchy: the secrecy, the control, and the occasional coldness beneath the surface of regal facades. Child psychologists and social workers were brought into the conversation, explaining how such experiences can leave lasting emotional scars. Being confined without basic necessities at a young age can cause deep trauma, one expert explained in a televised interview. Trust is broken, and it can take years to heal. Public protests, though small and contained, began appearing outside palace gates and royal residences. Groups calling for transparency, better child protection policies, and accountability within the royal household made their voices heard. These gatherings were covered extensively in the media, further amplifying the pressure on the monarchy to respond. The royal family's official silence in the face of mounting public scrutiny only fueled speculation and distrust. Press conferences were avoided, and carefully worded statements from palace spokespeople were often vague or dismissive. When Camilla was photographed attending high-profile events shortly after the scandal broke, some saw it as tone-deaf, while others interpreted it as an attempt to project normalcy and stability. Meanwhile, social media was rife with theories and rumors, some rooted in fact, others purely speculative. Conspiracy theories about palace intrigues, power struggles, and hidden histories proliferated, turning the story into a kind of royal soap opera for the digital age. Memes and videos circulated, mixing outrage with humor, underscoring the story's reach beyond traditional news audiences. The pressure wasn't just public. Within the palace, the walls seemed to close in. Staff who had been sworn to secrecy felt the weight of the event and the growing public eye. Allies of William and Catherine pushed for answers and reforms behind closed doors, while loyalists to Camilla and the existing order worked to contain the damage. The palace, once a symbol of unshakable tradition, was suddenly vulnerable in a way few had anticipated. For Charlotte, the public reaction was a mixed blessing. On one hand, the outpouring of support and calls for her protection were a balm for a wound still raw. On the other, the spotlight was uncomfortable, and the sense that her private pain had become public spectacle was difficult for a child to bear. The incident had cracked open the door on a secret world few outside the palace had ever glimpsed. And as the story continued to unfold, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a reckoning. One that would challenge the monarchy's carefully guarded image and force questions that could no longer be ignored. When a story as explosive as a princess locked in a cell breaks into the public sphere, experts are inevitably called in to weigh the emotional and psychological consequences. The incident involving Princess Charlotte became a flashpoint for child psychologists, royal historians, and legal analysts, each offering insights that deepen the gravity of what had happened behind closed doors. Child psychologists spoke candidly about the trauma that such an experience could inflict on a young child. Dr. Emily Harris, a specialist in childhood trauma, explained in a televised interview that being confined in a cold, dark space without food or water could cause not only immediate physical distress, but also lasting psychological harm. For a child of Charlotte's age, Dr. Harris noted, this kind of isolation and neglect can lead to severe anxiety, trust issues, and attachment problems. The feeling of abandonment in a space meant to be safe can have repercussions well into adulthood. Experts highlighted how children interpret punishment differently than adults. While discipline might be framed by some as tough love or teaching responsibility, the absence of basic care crosses into neglect and abuse. Children require consistent emotional support alongside any corrective measures, said Dr. Harris. What Charlotte endured is a profound breach of that trust. Royal historians contextualize the event within a long history of royal family scandals involving children. They drew parallels with past incidents where the pressures of royal protocol and public image sometimes overshadowed personal care and affection. Dr. James Whitaker, a noted historian, pointed out that The monarchy has always struggled with balancing the public's expectations of regal composure and the private needs of its members, especially children. Historically, royal children have often been subjected to strict discipline, sometimes harsh by today's standards. He also noted that secrecy around such events is not new. What is different now is the media landscape. With social media and relentless news cycles, it's almost impossible to keep such stories contained. The monarchy faces unprecedented scrutiny, and incidents that might have been quietly dealt with in the past are now public crises. Legal experts, meanwhile, debated whether the Queen consort could be held accountable under modern child protection laws. Attorney Lisa Morgan, specializing in family law, remarked, "While members of the royal family traditionally enjoy certain immunities, the question of liability in cases of alleged child neglect or abuse is increasingly complex. If it is proven that Camilla deliberately confined Charlotte without basic necessities, it could constitute a breach of legal duties of care." Morgan further explained that legal proceedings involving royalty are rare and fraught with political sensitivities, but public opinion and media pressure can push for inquiries or investigations that bypass traditional protections. The incident also prompted a wider discussion about the monarchy's role in setting standards for child welfare. Advocates argued that if the royal family failed to protect one of its own children, it raised questions about the adequacy of their approach to childcare in royal institutions and the messages sent to the public about acceptable behavior. Beyond the technicalities of law and psychology, experts underscored the human element. Dr. Harris concluded that behind the headlines and speculation is a child who deserves compassion and care. The impact of this incident will depend not only on what happened, but on how those around Charlotte respond in the coming years. These expert perspectives added layers of credibility and urgency to the unfolding narrative, reminding the public that the story was about more than palace intrigue. It was about a young life deeply affected by the decisions of those entrusted to protect her. The incident sent shockwaves not only through the public, but deeply fractured the royal family itself. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted, loyalties were tested, and the fault lines between members became glaringly visible. The event exposed a tension that had long simmered beneath the surface, one that now threatened to boil over into open discord. Prince Harry, living abroad and distanced from much of the day-to-day palace life, was among the first to react strongly. Known for his fierce protectiveness of family, especially children, Harry expressed deep outrage when he learned the details. His closest confidants reported that he was furious at Camilla's alleged actions, viewing them not only as cruel, but as symbolic of the dysfunction he had often spoken about within the institution. Harry's reaction was complicated by his own fraught relationship with the palace. His supporters saw his anger as a righteous defense of his niece, while critics questioned whether his response was fueled by long-standing grievances and a desire to challenge the establishment. Regardless, his public statements, though carefully measured, were laced with unmistakable condemnation. "Family must protect family," he said in an interview, "and when that doesn't happen, it shakes the very foundation of trust." Meghan Markle, ever attuned to the media spotlight, seized the moment to highlight what she described as systemic failings within the royal family's approach to care and compassion. She used the incident to call for greater transparency and reforms, positioning herself as an advocate for children's rights within and beyond royal circles. Her remarks ignited further controversy, with some praising her courage and others accusing her of exploiting a private family tragedy for public gain. Within the palace walls, William and Catherine found themselves navigating treacherous waters. Their primary concern was Charlotte's well-being, but they were also acutely aware of the political fallout. William, still grappling with the emotional impact of the incident, faced criticism from some quarters for not taking stronger action sooner, while others sympathized with the delicate position he occupied. Catherine, meanwhile, worked quietly behind the scenes to protect her children's privacy and shield them from media frenzy. Insiders described her as resolute and calm, a stabilizing presence amid chaos. Yet even she could not entirely escape the strain, as whispers of family discord reached the ears of staff and visitors alike. The divide within the family extended beyond immediate members. Some senior courtiers and advisors aligned themselves with William and Catherine, advocating for accountability and reform. Others remained loyal to Camilla and the established order, warning that rocking the boat could damage the monarchy's reputation irreparably. These internal factions complicated efforts to address the incident. Meetings behind closed doors were tense, often ending without resolution. Camilla herself maintained a guarded silence publicly, but those close to her described a woman who felt besieged and misunderstood, convinced that her actions had been misinterpreted or exaggerated. The family divide was not just about personalities or politics. It reflected deeper questions about power, tradition, and the future of the monarchy. For many, the incident symbolized a clash between old ways and new expectations, between authority exercised through fear and authority earned through trust. Charlotte, caught in the middle, became an unwitting emblem of these conflicts. Her public appearances became more guarded. The bright-eyed, carefree child the world once knew seemed quieter, more withdrawn. Royal observers noted the change, speculating on the emotional toll the incident and its aftermath had taken on her. The family divide showed no signs of healing quickly. Instead, it opened a Pandora's box of grievances, alliances, and resentments that would shape royal dynamics for years to come. The incident that began as a moment of personal cruelty had become a catalyst for profound institutional and familial upheaval.